Hey guys, thanks for joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. If you're a returning listener, it's great to have you back. If you're new to the channel, we're really glad you joined us. Hope you like what you hear. Our podcast is for people that want to learn something new or make themselves a little bit better every day. So today we're going to be talking about the death penalty. No, it can be a controversial topic in some circles. We used to be pro death penalty and we are now anti death penalty. And we're going to give you the 5 main reasons that we've changed our thought process on the death penalty, which coincidentally, none of them are moral or biblical. There has been throughout history, there has been a tendency or a belief that if you commit a heinous crime, and that the heinous is a relative term, so each society has decided what it qualifies or doesn't qualify as a potential death penalty case. So typically, aggravated murder or premeditated murder are cases that could qualify. Violent, super violent, sexual or physical assault against multiple people or a person can qualify. But for us, it's not actually the moral part. We don't struggle with the moral part of that question. We completely understand the argument of an eye for an eye, or you should suffer the same punishment that you imposed on somebody else. So we get all that. But those are not actually our arguments or what changed our mind to think differently about this. So with that said, let's just jump into our 5 points here. And we'd love to know from you. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on this subject? But let's jump into our points here and we'll see what you think. Number 1. So we actually think life in prison is a worse punishment than the death penalty. So there's obviously a finality to the death penalty. Does it take a while to work its way through all of the appeals and legal proceedings and et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, generally, if someone is sentenced to death, it's rare that death sentence is carried out quickly, like within 5 years. Most death penalty cases take over a decade to resolve to get to the actual implementation of the punishment. So even though there's a finality to it when it happens, having to, let's just say you're 30 years old and you're convicted of murder and you get life in prison with no possibility of parole. The average lifespan, we'll say it's man because men commit way more murders than women. So the average lifespan of a man in the United States is somewhere around 75 years. So can you imagine having to spend 45 years waking up every day to think about how you threw your life away, to think about what you did, to relive your crime in your head, to have to face that over and over and over again? We think that's a worse punishment than having your life taken, because that ends your pain, your suffering, your angst, your mental anguish. All of it goes away when the death penalty is implemented. So we don't actually think that's as bad of a punishment once you're in that situation as having to face every day the situation that you're in. There's a line in the movie 300 where the Spartan that rats on or turns against the Spartan army and shows the Peloponnesians the hot gates pass so they can get in behind him and helps them win the battle. And the leader of Sparta, Leonidas, says, "I hope you live forever." That's his way of saying, I don't ever want you to get away from what you've done. I want you to have to face it every day. Anecdotally, there's a death penalty advocate named Robert Blecker who interviewed death row inmates. And many of those inmates admitted that they feared life in prison more than execution because the years of isolation and hopelessness become hopeless and unbearable for the prisoner that has to face it every day. So when you think about the life that those death row inmates exist in prison, many of them spend 23 hours a day by themselves, whether that be in solitary confinement, in their very own cell, decades before they're executed. So can you imagine having to be by yourself for 23 hours a day, every day for decades? That's like the worst punishment that's meted out in the prison system. And there's been studies that show once they get to a certain point and have had to experience that long enough, that death row inmates will actually volunteer for execution and waive their rights and say, look, I just need this to end. I can't take it anymore, because they can't stand the psychological torture of waiting, of facing every day on their own, of living every day on their own. And so when you couple those things together, it sure seems to us like it's a way worse punishment to have to live the rest of your natural life in prison than it is to actually be executed and have an end put to all the pain and suffering that you are going through, largely, in most instances, through your own action. We'll talk about that a little bit further, but for the most part, we catch people, the right people, when they murder people. But it seems like it's a bigger punishment to us. So that's number one. Okay, number two is just the economics of it. It's actually generally cheaper to house a prisoner for their natural life than it is to prosecute and implement a death penalty case. So it seems like you would think that execution saves money, because that's, they're off the payroll once they're executed. But it generally costs significantly more because of all the legal wranglings that go on in death penalty cases. So California's death penalty system has cost taxpayers somewhere around $4 billion since 1978, and they've executed exactly 13 people. So that's a lot of money to spend on 13 executions. And when you think about what the cost is to house an inmate, somewhere between 20 and 40 grand a year, let's say they spend 30 years in and use the high end of that, 40 grand at 30 years is, what is that, 1.2 million bucks, somewhere in there. Well, I guess it's a little more than that, but 12 million bucks. But, executing a prisoner can cost 1 million to 3 million per case. And so when you do the math on how long generally death row inmates live, or life without the possibility of parole inmates live, versus the cost of absorbing case after case of death penalty cases, the math points to the fact that life in prison without possibility of parole is actually a cheaper alternative than death penalty cases. So Florida, for example, spends $51 million a year on the death penalty. And then compare that to the cost of sentencing everyone to life without parole, call it 20, 25 grand a year. The math works out and shows that it's cheaper to do life in prison without the possibility of parole. And it's the legal process that's the biggest expense by far, because clearly if you're going to take someone's life away, they need to have every right to appeal, every right to have their case reviewed, every right to have any potential wrongs that happened righted before that sentence is carried out. Because obviously it's very final. There's no unringing the bell after you execute somebody. And so we got to ask ourselves, is that cost worth it? Is it worth going through all that for something that a lot of people don't agree with already? If you keep a bad actor away from society in prison for their life without any possibility of parole, it accomplishes the same thing. And so it's a much cheaper alternative than the death penalty system we've got set up right now. Okay, so that's number two. Number three is we do absolutely convict innocent people of death penalty cases. And there has been over 100 since, when was it? 1973. There's been 190 people that have been exonerated after they were convicted of a death row crime. So, there's an example, there's a documentary, it's not documentary, there's a show on Netflix based on a death row inmate in Texas who was convicted for allegedly setting a fire that killed his children. And years later, when an actual forensic expert looked at the forensics of the case, they said, man, there's almost no way this was an intentionally set fire. This was an accidental fire. And you guys may have killed an innocent man when you put this guy to death. So, again, since 1973, over 190 people have been found innocent via DNA, via additional evidence that's been presented after the fact, whatever the case may be. But we felt more comfortable enough to say, no, this person didn't do it. We're going to release them. back out into society. So there was a study in 2014 done. It's in a publication called Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the estimate in there was that 4.1% of death row inmates are likely innocent, meaning they're sitting on death row waiting to die for a crime they did not commit. And if we find that out somewhere down the road, it'd sure be good to be able to make it right with that person, which we can't do if we execute them. Obviously, it's irreversible. There's no one ringing the bell, can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It is a final decision. And if we do somewhere down the road uncover evidence that shows this person is innocent, it's a terrible feeling to know, hey, we put that person to death and they are actually innocent and there's nothing we can do about it now. So we think about the wrongful execution as too big of a risk to continue executing people, even when we know they did stuff, for all the reasons we've talked about. The cost, the actual punishment being worse, of having to stay in prison. And then, like we're talking about here, we know we have innocent people on death row, and it sure would be terrible if we found out somewhere down the road that this person was innocent, and because we executed them, we can no longer make it right with them. So that's our number 3. Tip number 4 is actually a counter argument to a very common argument for the death penalty, which is the death penalty is a deterrent to criminals to not commit murders or violent acts because they're afraid of having their life taken via the death penalty if they're caught. But there's evidence that suggests that the death penalty does not prevent crime more effectively than life sentences. So either way, you're giving up the rest of your life. That life may come to an end sooner with a death penalty case, but you're not going out. You can't get married. You can't live your life. You can't have kids. You can't have a job. You can't experience all the great things the world has to offer if you're in prison for the rest of your life without parole. And so, there have been countries that have abolished the death penalty. Canada abolished the death penalty in 1976, and the murder rate declined after the death penalty was abolished instead of increasing. And when you think about people who do crime and law for the living, 88% of criminologists surveyed by the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology believe the death penalty does not deter crime. So 88% is a pretty overwhelming number. There's more anecdotal evidence that shows that states with the death penalty do not have lower murder rates than states without it. In fact, the South, Texas in particular, has the highest execution rate, but also the highest murder rates in the United States. And FBI data consistently show that states without the death penalty have lower violent crime rates than states that do have the death penalty. So if the whole point is to deter people from committing bad acts, there's not really any evidence to show that it actually does deter people from committing bad acts if we get rid of the death penalty or if we continue to use the death penalty. So it just seems like not a very good argument. There's no data to back it up. There's no anecdotal data to back it up. I think it's a matter of people wanting a feeling of fairness. You took that person's life. Now we're going to take your life. And we get that. We understand that feeling of fairness. We just don't think it makes sense long-term for all the reasons that we're talking about here. And then the 5th item on our list is when you look at the administration of the death penalty itself, it's very uneven and disproportionately affects poor people. And so we're going to leave race out of this conversation. And I think there's probably a conversation to be had around race and the death penalty. But when you trace it back to economic status, it's a very clear delineation between the haves and the have-nots, meaning the haves that can afford good representation in a murder case tend to get a better outcome than people who don't have any money, can't afford great representation, wind up with a public defender. And we're not disparaging public defenders in any way, shape, or form, but you're stretched so thin that to devote the proper time and energy to a murder case is hard. And that typically is going to go much better at a private law firm than it is at a public law firm, a public defender. And the people that wind up with public defenders are typically the poor in America. So, for example, there's a gentleman in Alabama named Clifford Jones who was sentenced to death with inadequate legal defense. He did not get a legal defense, at least not a good one. His court-appointed lawyer actually fell asleep during the trial, and his verdict was upheld upon appeal. So, when you look at the facts, over 90% of death row inmates could not afford their own lawyer and had to rely on court-appointed attorneys. And those court-appointed attorneys often lack the experience and resources that a private firm, that a much more affluent accused offender can afford. So there's a study by University of Colorado that found that defendants convicted of killing white victims were far more likely to receive the death penalty than those convicted of killing black victims. So you can see from the data that we're describing here that it's an uneven application of this law. In Louisiana, for example, a black defendant is 97% more likely to receive a death sentence if the victim is white. So if you're black and kill a white person in Louisiana, it doubles your odds of actually receiving the death sentence for that crime that you're being convicted of. So you got to ask yourself, does it create justice or does it reinforce inequities that are built into our system? And there's probably no way around those inequities. Like, not everybody's going to have a bunch of, look, if we got convicted or accused of murder, we couldn't defend ourselves. We wouldn't have enough money to mount a great defense of ourselves. We also wouldn't kill anybody. So there's that. But when you look at the application of the law, it's very uneven. So that's why it's our fifth reason why we do not support the death penalty. So real quick recap here, the 5 key arguments for us that make us decide not to support the death penalty long term. Life in prison is a worse punishment than the death penalty. It's more expensive to put someone in prison. It's more expensive to execute someone based on all the legal wrangling that goes on around those cases than it is to pay for life in prison for a prisoner. Number 3, innocent people have been executed. It'd be nice to be able to make things right when we uncover somebody that's been convicted wrongfully, and we now know through DNA evidence, through other evidence, that they did not commit this crime. And it'd be great to be able to deal with that because they're still alive because we didn't kill them. Number 4, there's no evidence to show that it deters crime. And number 5, it disproportionately affects poor and minority defendants. But it's really more a matter, in our mind, it's way more a matter of poor than it is of race. So that's how we think about it, guys. That's the episode for today. We'd love to hear from you what you think about this subject. We found it interesting. We read an article about a gentleman in Alabama who didn't score high enough on an IQ test until recently to be considered mentally fit to both stand trial, accept his punishment, and face the death penalty in Alabama. And that, reading that article this weekend, is what spurred our idea on this episode. So we hope you liked it. Hope you found it interesting. Love to hear from you, what you think about it. James puts it up over here every day. Head over to our website, saltygingertalk.com. Catch all our podcast episodes, all our social media links. We got a newsletter we publish every weekday. You can subscribe to there. And then obviously don't forget, like, comment, subscribe on our channel on whatever platform you consume it on. It's super helpful for us if you're able to do that. So, all right, this is the Monday episode. We're hoping everybody has a great week, and we'll see you on the next one.